No introduction needed, right? Archaeological dig, time traveler ship. You want me to get to the point? That works for me because I don't have long before the government spooks figure out which car I'm hiding under. I won't bother telling you how I graduated from Oxford, or how I pulled out of my previous dig salvaging the Baniyam Buddhas in Afghanistan when the US and Co. withdrew. All you need to know is that I went with them, and that's how I found myself about 50 miles southwest of Las Vegas, staring at a pearlescent metal hatch. Blimey, Freddy, you weren't kidding, I whistled, scratching the mole on my chin, staring at the mottled blue steel column protruding from orange earth at the bottom of the 30-foot pit. Even though I was used to the baking sun from my time in Hazarjat Highlands, the shade and coolness of the pit were welcome by the time Freddy and I had climbed down there. I told you, Freddy said, taking off his battered trucker cap to scratch his balding head. It's a goddamn flying saucer. I don't know about an alien spacecraft, but it's definitely older than any metal construction buried here has any right being. Leona stood, brushing the dust off her knees, and turned away from the oil barrel-sized column with its wheel-lock hatch roof. She greeted me with a warm hug, and she looked to Freddy and nodded. This was unsurprising. Leona and I had been undergraduates together at Oxford. Leona and Freddy had only met the day before, when her current university had called her about the phone call they'd received from him the day before that. She'd called me when she arrived because I'd called her the previous week to let her know I was safely out of Afghanistan. I'd agreed because of how Freddy found the hatch, or more accurately, why he'd been digging up the remote stretch of the desert he'd somehow come to own. He's told Leona's university, who told Leona, who told me, that he'd found a treasure map. He owned a house on the same land. While renovating the remote property, he'd found the map and coordinates hidden under some floorboards. 3 days ago, he rented a bulldozer and started going to town until he found the hatch. He told the university that he found a UFO. The university told Leona she still owed them for the prescription opioid addiction they kept hushed up. She told me a lot of swear words in French, and I told her I'd get the next plane ticket from Wisconsin once I was done being processed at Fort McCoy. Confusing? Sorry. All you need to know is that everyone was where they were when Scott, who none of us knew, removed his headphones and turned off the metal detector he'd been waving around. It's definitely not a saucer, he said, scratching his goatee. Wherever this leads, it goes off in one direction. No signal around any edges of the pit except where you stood. If it is a ship, this is at the nose. He gestured with his thumb over his shoulder to the hatch, his words intercut with the smack of chewing gum. Like a pirate ship? Freddy asked, raising a pudgy eyebrow at the news that the thing buried on his land wasn't a UFO, and wasn't like the one his grandpappy had told him about at Roswell. Well, it's more like a submarine, I'll bet. That is, if it is a ship. It's probably just a bunker left here by some prepper during the Cold War. A bunker that's over 5,000 years old? Leona had her hands on her hips, graying-haired face looking incredulous. I've seen a lot of buried metal. I don't know what this thing is made of, but it looks like steel. Do you know how long it takes for steel to rust? Especially when it's buried somewhere as dry as the desert? God save me from these idiots. I can see Scott's eyes behind the sunglasses, but I know they look sheepish. It had been decades since I'd made the impatient Leona swear, in French as well, but I still remembered the experience. I felt for Scott. If he was here and Leona was here, it meant he was Leona's assistant. This meant he was an undergrad. If there was one thing Leona couldn't stand, even when she was one, it was undergrads. Fortunately for Scott, and for you if you're bored of a middle-aged man getting nostalgic of a former flame, we weren't in an awkward silence for long. The shrill hiss was deafening as soon as it started. Oh, hell no, Freddy reached a pudgy arm into a duffel bag to the base of the pills ladder. When he stood back up, the meaty limb was holding a shotgun. Before we three academics could register what was going on, Freddy had the barrel pointed at the corroded pearlescent steel column. Oh oui, bien sûr, une bunker de guerre froid? Putain d'étudiant. Leona threw herself to the pit's edge, yelling, grabbing Scott by the arm, and taking him with her as well. They fell to the ground just in time to avoid being blasted by the thick vapor projected from 3/5 of the hatch's rim. Had Freddy and I stood a fraction to the right, we'd have had to do the same. I ducked anyway, though, only because the sudden high-pitched gaseous whistling triggered the attuned fight or flight response that I had developed back in Afghanistan. It wasn't until I looked up that I realized how lucky Scott was that Leona had developed the same senses during the time she spent with me there, living under the constant threat of rockets, grenades, and gunfire. The flat, almost ring of steam reached all the way to the walls of the pit. Once it subsided, after a few seconds of whistling, the densely packed sand and rock wasn't sand and rock anymore. It had turned to glass, sparkling, slightly glowing, still cooling glass. Thanks, Professor, Scott mumbled, pulling himself to his feet once the hatch had stopped shrieking. The sheepish look I imagined behind those dark sunglasses had only gotten worse. Don't mention it. Leona was already on her feet, once again brushing dust from her khakis. She turned to Freddy. Monsieur Frederick, please put on the gun. Freddy spat on the orange earth. The hell I will. I ain't about to let myself get eaten by some space monster. Oh mon Dieu, what is with men and these guns? Monsieur Frederick, please, whatever we're dealing with here, I don't think it's a... Bonk! Only Freddy didn't throw himself back to the pit floor. He raised the shotgun, aiming down the sights at the turning, rusted wheel on the center of the hatch. Leona, Scott, and I could only look up at the corroded steel column, mouths open as the wheel lock unscrewed. It turned for 30 long seconds, unseen gears and cogs grinding for the first time in, according to Leona's assessment, millennia. Leona wasn't protesting anymore. She'd run out of words, French or English. She was staring with wide eyes at the hatch, just like the men of the pit, too shocked to speak. She didn't even have words when there was a second loud thunk, followed by a loud creaking. The fiery archaeological professor was silent even as the rusted circular plate started to open on its thick, ancient hinges. She didn't need words when it clanged fully open with the last energetic swing. None of us did. We were too busy screaming. That's when I learned Freddy wasn't a man who messed around. I heard the click of him readying his weapon the instant the two sets of rubber-covered fingers appeared on the rim. He grunted in unison, with the top of the helmeted head emerging from the pipe. And he'd already fired before I got a chance to take in any details of the figure pulling itself out of the hole. Qu'est-ce que c'est ton problème, sacre bleu putain? We unarmed three screamed again. We heard the distant, metallic thump of the headless body hitting the bottom of the shaft within the pit, but not before we had time to wipe blood and glass off of our shocked faces. See? Freddy yelled with a grin, staring around at the mess of bone, glass, gore, and plastic on the opposite wall. I told you, nerds! It was a UFO! I told you there'd be a space monster. Ugh, this blood tastes real human for a space monster. Scott was still laying on the floor, spitting dramatically and wiping flecks of splatter from his goatee. What? I'm just saying what we're all thinking, he added when he saw Leona and my own horrified expression. I couldn't argue with him, though. If you're screaming while in the presence of someone getting shot with the shotgun at point-blank range, chances are you're gonna get some blood in your mouth. I recognized the coppery tang on my tongue, too. I also couldn't shake the knowledge that the chances of an alien having fingers and hands that are shaped exactly like a human being's, that seemed astronomically small. We couldn't stop Freddy going down the hole, though we did try. We followed him, of course. Leona and I weren't about to let whatever lay inside this, whatever it was, be claimed by a redneck with the bloodlust for aliens. Scott came too, but he didn't have a choice, because when he protested, Leona swore at him in French, and that was the end of that. We were descending the ladder for about 2 minutes before we reached the bottom. Good thing I packed flashlights, eh? Sure enough, Freddy had 3 battery-powered torches in the duffel bag he'd slung over his shoulder before climbing into the hatch. This was indeed a good thing too, because the space at the bottom was pitch black aside from the thin rays of the Nevada sun able to find their way this far down the hole. Scott vomited when they clicked into life, and even Freddy let out a Jesus, followed by a sharp intake of breath. The figure Freddy shot had broken several limbs as it tumbled down the hole. A fair few more when it landed at the bottom. There were a few sharp bones poking through its dark rubber suit. It didn't have a head because, as you'll recall, Freddy had blown it off with buckshot. What did remain of the lower jaw, neck, and base of the skull was surrounded by the remnants of a thick plastic-looking helmet. The interior was lined with a lime green gel, and various pipes and frayed wires ran from the interior into a thick tube. The sockets where this tube would have connected had been lost to Freddy's shotgun, but the pack full of fluids with the wire and pipe-filled cable trailing from it allowed me to paint a rough picture. One I'd confirm in a few moments once we started exploring the rest of the ship. What shocked me about the figure, what caused me to yell and Leona to clasp a pair of hands to her mouth, was the name of the badge on the headless, distressingly human female's corpse chest. IP set, Dr. Harper-Girard. A name you know? Freddy asked, poking the body with his gun. Mine, Leona and I replied in unison, shooting each other an awkward glance immediately after. Freddy looked confused. Well, mine is Harper's, hers is Girard, I explained. Surely the university sent some paperwork? He shrugged. They might have done, but I'll be honest, the wife checks the mail. I just knew they were sending some science folk to poke around and sign the bit of paper that said I'd found a bona fide UFO. Leona rolled her eyes before turning to me. What do you think it means? What's IP set? I'm frightened, Robert. I know, I replied. Me too. I recognize those hips. They're... I know. I shot her a glare. I couldn't bear to hear out loud the observation we'd both made. I recognized those hips too. I'd spent a whole evening staring at them on a dance floor many decades ago. On the first night, Leona and I's friendship gained the suffix with benefits. We both tried to ignore our growing fears as we poked around the ship's entrance. The word IP set meant nothing to me at the time. It wasn't until my torch illuminated some signage of the rusted wall spelling out Institute of Paranatural Science, Events, and Technology that I even knew it was an acronym. Other than this revelatory information, the room was pretty barren, save for a rack containing another suit of the same kind the now deceased Dr. Harper-Girard had been wearing. Scott had been right. The hatch was indeed at the nose of the ship. The room was a sharp triangle shape, with the suit storage set into the thin wall at one end. The wider one at the other was featureless, save for a door and keypad. The keypad was a kind of fingerprint scanner. Its screen was still half illuminated, despite the rust and chipped paint of the walls and floor grates. The small LED flashed red, with Freddy and Scott pressed their thumbs on the surface. With a faint beep, it turned green for Leona, prompting a gulp from both of us. Her hand found its way into mine when the steel door hissed and slid open, something that hadn't happened for a long time. Holy shit, Freddy yelled, when we'd collectively had enough time to try and make sense of the room beyond. You still don't think this is a UFO? No, Scott replied, voice weak and quiet. No, I think you're right. This is a UFO. Leo and I exchanged a sidelong glance when we took our first steps across the threshold. A UFO with signs on the walls in plain English? Aliens with names like Dr. Harper-Girard? Cultivate your mind, as Leona would say. I didn't say anything out loud because I didn't have a better explanation, but I knew straight away whatever we found here was not extraterrestrial. It wasn't until we got to the final room, at the other end of the ship, that the horrifying truth revealed itself to us. The vast chamber we found before this only created further questions for us to torture ourselves with in the interim. It goes without saying that none of my knowledge of ancient civilizations was helpful. I'd stopped relying on prior experience the moment I saw the hatch. In this region of North America, you expect to be excavating Los Gossuet and Panamint holy sites, not ancient steel vessels that are somehow both rusted and more technologically advanced than anything you've ever seen. The middle section of the ship was mostly used as some kind of storage bay from the looks of things. This much we could work out. It doesn't take a genius to recognize stacked crates, no matter how unfamiliar the plastic-like material they're made from looks. We were walking between stacks of these dark red crates for about 5 minutes when we emerged in the clearing we'd spied from back at the other doorway, visible only because of the dancing and swirling lights above it on the distant ceiling. The heart of the ship was unlike anything we've ever seen before. Our torches were unnecessary. The hundreds of clear tubes sprouting from the floor-to-ceiling vat that made up the bulk of the engine that was housed inside this room was filled with a luminescent green liquid. It cast the whole room with an emerald glow, carving out the array of components and mechanisms on the engine whose purposes I couldn't fathom within these eerie chlorophyllic highlights. I could guess the purpose of the bulbous dome set into the base of the vat, though. You don't need a doctorate in esoteric engineering to work out the meaning of power level 2%. This entire thing was a battery. And thanks to a glass viewing port on the dome's surface, I could see from where the ship drew its power. I could see it, but I'm not sure I could believe it. I'm still not sure I want to. Inside this dome, there was a man wearing a mottled blue mask of the same pearlescent metal as the hatch, although the mask was not rusted or corroded. A man suspended in clear, bubbling fluid, connected to the engine by the glowing tubes that ran from it into the hidden ducts into the ship's ceiling. A man that, as we could hear, even though the glass was thick and the mask was hard steel, you could hear a man that was screaming. I couldn't tell you how old he was. That's why all 4 of us started screaming with him when we saw him. His age kept changing. He was flickering, phasing in and out of existence every few seconds as we watched at completely random intervals. When we arrived, his body was ancient, wizened and wrinkled and shriveling like a raisin. Then he'd flickered, and his body was disrupted by a static like an old television set. When the static stopped, he re-emerged as a middle-aged man, only a year or so younger than Leona and myself. The next flicker, he was a baby. Then, he was in his 20s. Then, he was a child. Then, the cusp of puberty. My God. Freddy was so taken aback, he actually lowered the barrel of his shotgun. Scott was somewhere off in the shadows, being sick again. I know the eyes behind those glasses weren't sheepish anymore, unless Scott sobbed and blubbered when he was embarrassed. Leona's grip on my hand tightened. Mon Dieu. Robert, we have to help that poor soul. Aidez-moi. Help me find a door. I don't think there is a door, I replied, mouth dry. And don't touch it. We don't know what it is. I pulled her back towards me, stopping Leona from rushing to the shrieking man, boy, baby, with tubes painfully grafted to his back. Aside from the pearlescent blue steel mask, they were the only thing in the battery tank that didn't shimmer or flicker. Just this poor thing and his wretched, twisted body existed there. Unfortunately, I wasn't close enough to stop Freddy. Son of a bitch, we've got to get him out of there! Before any of us could stop him, he dropped the shotgun and was feeling around the rim of the viewing glass of the hatch, and he was looking for a mechanism to get it open. He was hammering on the flashing power level 2 screen. And then, an alarm went off. Alert, alert, alert. Non-classified personnel detected. Mission compromised. Repeat, alert, alert, alert. Non-classified personnel detected. Mission compromised. Flushing remaining distemporal assets. Flushing non-classified personnel. Alert, alert, alert. The darkness around us was piercing now, with red as well as emerald light. A shrill ringing blasted from hidden speakers, competing with the repeating security message to see which could deafen us first. Even Scott had to stop puking to ram his fingers into his ears. I felt Leona's grip leave mine, though I'm not sure who let go of who. From somewhere up ahead in the darkness, from the depths of the ship we hadn't yet explored, I could hear a man's scream, even above the din. Because of what happened to Freddy and Scott, my own screams soon joined his. As soon as the message had repeated itself twice, dozens of needle-thin hooks on string-like steel cables, they shot up from the floor and around both of them. They both yelled as the miniature barbed grapples found purchase on their skin. My ears screamed when I had to take my hands off them, but if I hadn't, I couldn't have held Leona back when the cables retracted. I'll never forget Freddy's face when the dozens of hooks snapped back into the floor. I'll never forget his screams as the barbs took lumps of his flesh with him. What will haunt me more is Scott's tears, the way I could see him mouthing for his mum even after one of the pneumatic micro-harpoons tore through his bottom lip, clean from his face, and tore his jaw right off, leaving only his teeth, gums, and upper jaw exposed. The second wave of hooks followed the first, and just as quickly flayed whole sections of Freddy and Scott. By the time the rapid-fire onslaught of barbs and cables was finished, I was sobbing, backed into a corner, with Leona trying her hardest to bury herself forever into my chest. The ship's defense mechanism worked through men like a school of piranha, turning them from people to clouds of red mist and slack-jawed, glistening skeletons in a few short minutes. And the hooks didn't stop. They kept firing, and they continued shooting out, digging in, slicing, and crushing bones until nothing at all remained of the Americans in our party. Non-classified personnel flushed. Remaining distemporal assets flushed. Mission compromised. Breach report filed. Contemporary IPSET pickup initiated. Non-classified personnel flushed. The new message repeated as loudly as the first, but at least the alarm had stopped. Neither of us were in much of a state to appreciate that, though. I was too busy crying like a child, and Leona was too busy jabbering nonsense in French. Somehow, one of us managed to compose ourselves and then reassured the other. I don't know who did what. I do know it was Leona that pointed out the scream from deeper in the ship. I was the one who wanted to run and never come back, and she was the one who wanted to press forward. She won that argument. So that was how we found ourselves, after another 5 minutes, walking between more rows of dark red crates at a second door. I think somehow I knew even then what would happen when I put my thumb to it, because I didn't jump as much as Leona did. It was still enough to make me yelp, though. The sight of that door unlocking and hissing open from my thumb filled me with dread and horror, second only to that within the room. Within this room, it was a bedroom. It was poorly lit, but remarkably clean, not rusted. There was a double bed against one wall, a desk, and a small tiled section in one corner with a curtain to hide a combination shower, toilet, sink space. It was a bedroom that had been lived in, too. There were pens on the desk, a notepad, a half-eaten sandwich that was free of mold. There was a red book face down on one pillow, and a cup of still steaming hot coffee on one of the bedside tables. There was even a microwave set into one wall. There were photographs next to the microwave, held on with plastic magnets to bulky metal boxes, which I assume was a fridge. I recognized the people in those photos, even though the faces were older than when I'd seen them. So did Leona. She knew the woman with her hair slightly grayer than her own stood with a team of scientists in one, just as much as she knew the same, even grayer woman in a modest wedding dress stood next to the man I recognized in another. He was in a lot of photos, almost always with her. I knew his hairline, even if there was less of it. I knew the mole on his chin, too. That alone would have been enough to prompt Leona and me to turn and run from the ships as fast as we could. We did, but not just because of how familiar yet old the couple in the photographs were. We ran because at the opposite end of the room were two glowing green pods. Both of them had Dr. Harper-Girard above them on steel plaques. One was empty, a trail of glistening footprints leading from it to the shower, toilet space, to the fridge area, the microwave, and out the door. The other had a man in it, a man wearing a rubber suit with an IPSET Dr. Harper-Girard badge, a man with a thick black sludge pumping into him through the tube set into his mouth. Even though his eyes were crossed, there was blood pouring from his nostrils and tar-like slime pooling at his chin. I knew his face as well as I knew my own, because despite a few more wrinkles and a little more male pattern baldness, it was me. We'd been running so hard and fast that both of us had to stop and retch when we found ourselves back in the pit. I do remember that it was I who took Leona's hand the second time. Seeing my dead self in some kind of stasis pod broke me. I think it was also the final piece of the who was the Dr. Harper-Girard Freddy shot puzzle that snapped Leona too, because she didn't resist. She didn't stop to ask me why or say anything in French. She just ran with me. She ran with me all the way to the hired car. She ran with me all the way to the airport on the flight back to London, to my old home. And she's been running with me ever since the IPSET spooks showed up outside our house. Even though we changed our names and went to great lengths to burn every paper trail, she was running with me all the way until early this morning, when they finally got her. We've been moving around the UK for the last 4 years. We thought we'd be safe somewhere as remote as the forgotten Dovercourt. We were wrong. They're nearly at the car I'm hiding under now. They've been chasing me on foot across Essex County all day. It's nearly midnight. I'm growing tired. Part of me thinks I should just give myself in. I won't, though. They keep saying they just want to talk, to ask a couple of questions about what we'd seen in Nevada. They keep telling me that Leona is safe. I believe them, but I'm still not going. I know that once I do, everything will be fine, and somehow in a few years, I'll find myself agreeing to be frozen in that damn time machine. Someone, probably Leona, will convince me that if we can set the awakening date just a little earlier, we'll be able to change things in this time. There will be some reason we had to go back to, of course. Some apocalypse event so disturbing, so horrific that decent people like Leona and I will agree to travel in a time machine powered by a temporally displaced human in an arcane mask. That's why I'm hiding under the car. Destiny has called me, but I don't want to answer. I don't want to join IPSET. I don't want to save the world. I already tried and I already failed. The version of me that got out from under the car is dead, filled with black sludge somewhere and rotting in a stasis chamber underneath the Nevada desert. I know it won't be any different when it's my turn. If you're reading this, please somehow volunteer yourself. I know one of you will be crazy enough to want to try this suicide mission in my place. I know there will be plenty of you who hate your own mundane lives enough to pick apart the IPSET puzzle, to give your life purpose by sacrificing it to prevent whatever this apocalypse is. You might hate your life enough to want that. I know I don't. I've only got a few decades left before I'm officially old. I want to spend them with Leona. Not like this. I don't want to die as a distemporal asset. I don't want to spend my last seconds with the toxic purge fluid being flushed through my system, choking and in agony because my younger self allows Freddy to set off a security failsafe. I don't want to kiss Leona goodbye in the future knowing what happens when she opens the hatch in the past. Our future selves weren't that much older than us. We'd finally found each other after all these decades. We deserve more time. It's not fair. I'm a coward and I'm not ashamed of that. I don't want to die like my future self, cold and alone, outside of my own present. I refuse for that to be my destiny. I'm not a martyr or a savior or some kind of chrononaut. I'm just a guy. A scared, helpless guy hiding under a car. Please, someone else step up and be the tragic hero of the story. I never asked to discover my future self in a time machine at an archaeological dig.